Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Afterschool Alliance's first webinar of 2025. I am Eric Peterson, Senior Vice President for Policy, and looking forward to tackling a variety of issues on federal policy, potential funding opportunities, challenges, particularly focused at the federal level today on the White House and Congress. And our second part of our webinar series will continue tomorrow, focusing at the state and local level. But first, we'll talk through a little bit of housekeeping. So next slide. If you are having any issues at all with the webinar, please try to close out and come back on. The recording and the webinar is being recorded, and recording and slides will be sent to you to your email as a follow-up for all that participated in the webinar. If you have questions throughout the course of the webinar, we are going to try to leave questions to a Q&A session at the end. However, please go ahead and ask your questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll keep an accounting of those so we can go back to those as well. Some of the questions we might be able to answer in the chat as well during the webinar. Make sure your chat is set to everyone so we can all see your questions as well. And as many of you are already doing, if you care to introduce yourself to us today and to your colleagues, please go ahead and do that in the chat with your name, organization, and city or area where you're viewing today. And with that, next slide. Let's start off with a quick poll. If you have reached out to your member of Congress, your representatives or senators, that is, in the past 6 months in support of after-school and summer learning programs, let us know by clicking the link in the chat, and would love to get a sense for how many folks have engaged recently, knowing that many of you have new members that started the 119th Congress, and so you'll need to reach out again. But would love to get a sense for how many folks have reached out. So as that's coming through, and never fear if you haven't yet, hopefully by the end of the webinar today, you'll have the information you need to go ahead and reach out, to introduce yourself, and to start developing a relationship with your member of Congress and senators, so that they know and understand the amazing work that you're doing at your local program, either during the school year, after school, or this upcoming summer. All right, so it looks like we have a great mix of folks that have reached out and folks that haven't. And of course, by reaching out, we mean phone calls, emails, in-person meetings. Maybe a member or staff came out to your site and visited. And again, we're gonna talk through some of those opportunities a little bit later on today as well. All right, let's jump in then with the next slide. Joining myself today on our webinar for the next hour or so will be my colleagues Jillian Luckner, Policy Director at the Afterschool Alliance, and Jennifer Reinhardt, Senior VP of Strategy and Programs at the Afterschool Alliance. And when they speak, their bios will appear in the chat. And then we're super excited also to have joining us a little later on today, Rachel Miller, Director of the Shine Afterschool Program at Lehigh Carbon Community College in Pennsylvania. Who will be talking through some of the advocacy efforts that she's done in the past and plans to do this year as well, developing relationships, as we mentioned, with her members of Congress, as well as state representatives, and to help build their support. Next slide. All right, so let's get into it. We are, of course, in the 119th Congress. We'll be welcoming in Washington, D.C., a new administration, new president who will be sworn in on Monday, January 20th. And so with that, with all those new faces and a new 119th Congress, a new administration, come both new challenges from an out-of-school time perspective, as well as new opportunities. A couple of the key areas that we know from the Trump administration coming in, both as a combination from the previous Trump administration, who many of us worked with more than 4 years ago, as well as from Agenda 47, the campaign platform, and other tools and materials and op-eds. Sort of from that information is these couple of bullets here in terms of what we know and what we're expecting from the new administration. Caveat, I don't work for the new administration, and therefore, this is, again, projections and reading tea leaves and what we are expecting. But we also expect the unexpected in terms of other things that may come up, other priorities, other challenges, and other opportunities. We do know from Agenda 47 that this incoming Trump administration really emphasizes the role of schools and K-12 education as a key vehicle to prepare young people for the workforce, for college and careers, and that they see as sort of the main goal that schools should be focusing on. So that's a little bit of a shift from previous federal education policy that was maybe focused on other areas in addition to sort of that workforce pathway piece. A lot of the areas that they emphasize, though, will be familiar to you as a positive youth development or out-of-school time provider or advocate. Project-based learning, pre-apprenticeships and apprenticeships and internships, particularly for older youth. Another key theme for the incoming administration is local and state control. So seeing particularly for education that they see less of a federal role, sort of de-emphasize federal role for education in general, particularly for K-12 education, and that more local school district and local state control should be the direction that they see education policy moving in. What that could mean is potentially, they propose some block grants to states to determine, and then allow states to determine the use of funds, things like parent choice, school choice, and vouchers are also part of their priorities as well. There's been a lot of talk about the desire for the incoming Trump administration to want to eliminate or de-emphasize the Department of Education. That's probably the number one question that we've gotten here at the Afterschool Alliance in terms of policy questions since the election took place, as to what that means, when will that happen, what does that look like? A couple things on that. So why that is, has been outlined as a priority for in a number of documents from the campaign and from the incoming Trump administration. It would take an act of Congress, which would be 60 votes in the Senate in order to do that. There are other things which would be a challenge. It's not a new idea. It's something that's been floated and legislation has been introduced almost every Congress going back since the early 80s when the Department of Education came into being, that sought to eliminate or de-emphasize. So that's not to say it wouldn't happen, but it is a lot more difficult than simply just wishing it to happen. There are possibilities around de-emphasizing the department, so moving some of the roles, like the career check education pieces could potentially be moved over to the Department of Labor. Some of the other funding streams could be moved over to Health and Human Services. So there are other things, and also things with staffing. If there are fewer staff at the federal level, Department of Education, it makes it harder for them to do their job and to do some of the functions that we have come to expect the Department of Education of doing. Another piece in terms of the priorities of the incoming administration is a desire to cut federal spending in general. So education, but beyond that, to other agencies, and of course the Department of Governmental Efficiency, the informal organization known by the acronym DOGE, that's been created by the incoming administration, is really seeking to look at where potential cuts could be and to increase with the goal of increasing government efficiency. Again, what that translates out into over the course of the next several months and years remains to be seen. On the childcare side, the previous Trump administration was very supportive and had several initiatives around expanding support and access to childcare. This incoming administration is a little bit more neutral on childcare, but we'll see what happens. And similarly with STEM, the incoming administration has been, as they were last time, very supportive of STEM, particularly around supporting job skills and supporting jobs as well. And then finally, again, broader than education, but extending tax cuts that were passed in 2017 is a key priority. It's important to note that many of these were priorities for the previous Trump administration. Some of them came to pass, many of them did not come to pass. And It's also important to note, if we go to the next slide, that while you see here sort of the history of the last couple administrations in terms of education funding specifically. So their proposed budgets that generally come out every year in the spring, winter, spring, February, March, going back to the Obama administration in 2012. The colors, so the yellow for Obama, the red for Trump, and the green for Biden represent what they wish to happen in terms of education funding. And then the black boxes are what actually happened in terms of Congress either cutting or funding education. And so you'll see, while the Trump administration, those three red bars, proposed pretty significant cuts as part of their budget requests. In fact, the actual education funding that happened those 4 fiscal years represent increases to education for 21st century community learning centers and after school and summer funding in particular. We saw over those 4 years of the previous Trump administration about a $60 million increase for 21st century. Part of that due to the focus and attention that was brought by the administration on wanting to cut after school, and sort of the reverse of that happening, of people really understanding how important these programs were, telling the story, champions in Congress speaking up and saying, no, actually, these programs are really effective and important. We need to keep them and actually need to fund them more. And so it remains to be seen, again, what happens with the second Trump administration. But in terms of context, important to note that significant cuts have been proposed in the past, and that advocacy, telling the story, and the effectiveness of programs have been successful in mitigating those proposed cuts in the past. And thank you, Lucy, for putting a link to this information on the chart. This comes from the Committee for Education Funding, an organization that we work with and are a member of here in Washington, D.C., that is about 100 organizations committed to ensuring that the federal government continues to support education. Next slide. Thank you. So that's the administration side. The other piece of the puzzle, obviously, is Congress. And with the new 119th Congress kicking off the first week in January, we are looking at sort of 3 main priorities or vehicles, if you will, that Congress will be addressing. The first is reconciliation. And so some of this you'll see echoes what the administration put forward in terms of their priorities. The spending cuts, to mandatory programs, extending the tax cuts and tax credits. This is important from our perspective, not necessarily because we don't anticipate, and normally discretionary funding is not cut as part of a budget reconciliation process, but it would potentially decrease the entire sort of size of the pie, making it harder for there to be discretionary funding when that process happens during the normal appropriations process. So reconciliation is still something that we're paying attention to. And there have been a number of, no language yet, but it is something that's being worked on now with Congress. And there certainly could be some impacts in some of the programs that could be cut, that are mandatory spending, that could affect out of school time. But the primary funding streams for out of school time will be outside the focus of reconciliation. Again, will likely happen pretty soon in terms of the timing. This will mainly be budget committees and what we call authorizing committees. So that's the Help Committee, or Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions in the Senate, and the House Education and Workforce Committee, that will get instructions from the budget committees about what they should cut or devote funding to. And then we have some suggestions which are same across all 3 of these buckets in terms of actions that you can take, and we'll talk more about that a little later on with Rachel. The second sort of big piece going on, so I should say on timing, reconciliation is likely starting now. We heard from the Speaker Johnson in the House today that he would like to have sort of the first step of this, the budget resolutions, done by mid-February. That's a really aggressive timeline. And then he sees this being passed and signed into law before Easter, so before April 20th. So while that is all happening, and the focus will be on that, at the same time, the second bucket on your slide of FY25 appropriations will need to happen as well. And that's the result of the continuing resolution that passed last December. So that is what sort of, unlike mandatory spending and reconciliation, that's what actually keeps the government funded and going. And if and that current deadline for government funding for this fiscal year is March 14th. So what that means is by March 14th, the Congress has to pass and it has to be signed into law either another spending bill, a permanent spending bill for fiscal year 2025, or another continuing resolution, or we face a government shutdown. And that piece, FY25 appropriations, is where things like 21st Century Community Learning Center, Title I for schools, career tech education, AmeriCorps, Child Care Development Block Grant, a lot of those programs all of those programs are part of that FY25 appropriations process. And so that's where, again, voices will really need to be heard. Last year, the House appropriations bill had lots of cuts to education programs, although they did not single out cutting 21st century and kept that level. But we don't know yet what the landscape will look like, what that proposed new FY25 appropriations bill will look like in the House and the Senate. And so members of Congress, particularly the new ones, but also the old ones, really need to hear how important funding for after school and summer are, what the impact is at the local family level. And then, in between here, possible second reconciliations, looking more and more that there won't be that it'll all be lumped into the first one, but you never know. So we could have a second one in here somewhere. And then FY26 appropriations. So fiscal year 2026 at the federal level begins October 1st of 2025, and often what that would mean is the president would propose their budget for FY26 in February. That's likely not going to happen this year. It'll be pushed back a bit. But that'll be, again, another opportunity to make the case for why funding for education and after school and summer in particular should be included, and that cuts should be avoided, eliminations should be avoided as well, and the reasons why for that. But before we get to FY26, we'll have to do FY25. So it'll be a very busy process. And next slide will tell you who the people are who are going to be making these decisions. The congressional key committee leadership for both on the Senate side and the House side, the education committees and the appropriation committees, who those leaders are. So if you see your state up there, that's extra responsibility on you to reach out to your members from your states that are in those leadership positions to make sure they know how important after school and summer programs are, the impact that they're having, as well as stories about what it looks like what it could look like if those programs were reduced or cut or eliminated. And then we'll put links in the chat and also in the follow-up. So you have full members of the Help Committee, Appropriations Committees in the House and the Senate, and Education Committee in the House to see if your members are on there. One important note, if your members, if your state is not in there and your member of Congress is not on one of these key committees, never fear. The margins in the House and Senate are extremely slim this year again. And that means every single member of Congress, every voice is important, everyone matters. And so still reach out, but just a particular emphasis if your states are one of the ones, if your members are from are on one of these committees, that a little bit more incentive to reach out as well. And with that, if we go to the next slide, my colleague Jillian is going to jump in here to kind of weave in and connect where some of these issues and some of these priorities from the administration and Congress, how they relate back to the incredible work that you're doing every day in after school and then in summer programs this summer. Jillian?
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. So I think that Eric did the heavy lift here, and my part is kind of the easy and the fun part, which is just to recognize that the work that you're all doing, that After School has been doing for a long time, really resonates with what we're hearing from the administration and much of the new Congress. And so what we did here is just kind of looked at some of the things that were mentioned in Trump's Agenda 47 kind of platform, as well as the America First Policy Institute organization where Linda McMahon, who is the nominee for the Department of Education, is coming from, and put those in red kind of underneath some of the work that you already do. So Eric already mentioned this, but when we really think about it, the work that we are doing is critical to education and development, which is a priority of the administration. They just focus on the project-based elements of it, the choice elements of it, the workforce development elements of it. But all of these things are leading directly to their goals. After all, you really can't have a revived industrial base, advanced technologies in our military if you don't have a creative workforce, a workforce that is aware of the careers in their area, that has meaningful partnerships, and that has the literacy, STEM, and math that are encouraged by some of the creative work that we do in cooking, in theater, and in all the ways that we engage students. On the next slide, I just related again to the education piece being impactful, right? And so these are programs that we know are effective for supporting families and society, which again is what we're hearing that the administration is looking for, things that really move the needle. And Jen will talk on our team more about the research here, but just want to highlight a couple things in kind of the way that I sometimes phrase, or I've heard sometimes phrased, what's going on in the field and the way that I think it really makes an impact. So oftentimes we talk about the how, but I think that this administration is looking more for kind of the what. And so, for example, we talk about how we cultivate the right staff and the environments to improve social connectedness, to caring adults, peers, and improve overall well-being. But when you really think about what, this is moving the needle on things like school safety. And when you look at kind of America First policy recommendations, they have an entire policy brief on education and school safety. And you won't be surprised that one of the first recommendations is kind of school infrastructure, what some people call school hardening. The second recommendation is student mental health, well-being, connections with peers, connections with adults. And so, really on par there with what they're looking for and what we're already doing. Similarly, when I think about the economic impacts piece, I think one of the ways that we see it is just providing the hours of care that meet the needs of our community. But really, the effect of that, of course, is that you have working parents who now don't have to reduce their hours over the school year. They don't have to take time off over the summer. They have the ability to actually accept promotions. And so the effect is these economic impacts on the workforce. Right? Our employers can find the employees they're looking for. Our income in households is going up. Parents are working full time. They have more economic stability in their own homes, and it's increasing the tax base of our whole community. So really, again, kind of relating what the work we're already doing to this work. On the next slide, I kind of dig in a little bit of detail to some of the things that I think Eric was talking about. He talked about those three opportunities in the coming year, the reconciliation package and the two appropriations packages. And within those are, opportunities to really reinforce the work being done in 21st century community learning centers, to talk about childcare, and to talk about taxes as they relate to after school and summer programs. So the first three kind of bullets here are really about the 21st century community learning centers, which will be in the two appropriations packages. And I think one of the things that I know that we're thinking to emphasize here is making sure that people recognize after school as both essential and unique in regards to its piece of the education puzzle. And by essential, I mean, this has always been clear to us. I think the COVID pandemic made it even more clear that when students are in that 80% of time that they're not in the school day, their situations are highly unequal, and yet they're still learning. And that's when students can advance in their learning or unfortunately fall behind. And so really after school is an essential piece of the education puzzle. However, it's also a very unique piece in that it can't just be combined or block granted to a state or pushed into Title I, because it loses the ability to innovate. It loses the ability to work in different ways with families, community members, and students and find the impacts that it's always found. So on the other piece of 21st century, really messaging that funding piece as being critical. We can't do more with less. We know in order to retain the high quality teachers, the long-term staff that we've had, and provide the engaging curriculum that keeps students coming, we need the funding to do that. If we cut our funding and we don't have those staff, or we don't have the ability to offer engaging curriculum, we know directly we're losing the students that make the impacts that lead to school safety, that lead to the improvements in math and English achievement. So want to message that as well. And then on the other piece for 21st century, really want to think about the infrastructure. We know that quality is absolutely critical for the field, but it's not the kind of thing that is efficient if every single program is reinventing the wheel from the ground up for professional development for quality. 21st century program has a foundation at the federal level and things like the NTAC Center for Technical Assistance of providing research-based best practice to the field. And then at the state level, it has a 5% set aside that can be used for quality funds for professional development, technical assistance, to really build relationships with statewide after-school networks and get quality after school standards, observational tools, and professional development that's timely, research-based to the field in an effective way. So want to make sure that those are all messaged. In the childcare space, again, this is going to be a big piece of the conversation. We think it's bipartisan, highly popular, usually done in the form of vouchers, which is kind of popular in this administration. But yet we know that although families talk about childcare and think about all the ages of care and the children in their households, often in the policy landscape, it's a focus of 0 to 5, and that's sometimes unintentional. intentional, but it can have real consequences for the field. And we want to make sure that our messaging suggests that that policy landscape needs to be broadened to ensure that the policies are the right size for school age providers. And so what that can look like is, for example, if you have a policy that talks about safe sleep training for the professionals who are serving toddlers, you can have a policy that talks about mental health first aid for the policies of school age professionals. So just making sure that that policy piece of the puzzle in childcare fits the needs of the field. And then finally, just quickly on the tax piece, which again, Eric mentioned in the reconciliation, really thinking about what this looks like, right? This is the Tax and Job Act, if it were to be extended, would be about $4.6 trillion of funds over the next 10 years, as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. So this is something that should have, as much as possible, everybody engaged in this discussion because it's a huge government expenditure. And so for our field, and I think Jen will talk about this a little more, we know the returns on investment of investing in childcare and after school programs, both now in the short term and in the long term. And I think that it's going to be important to message that because as Eric was saying, the money that we do spend in any tax package is money that we might not be able to spend in discretionary spending later on. And so there's a real ability to talk about how these make returns for communities. For example, the state of Indiana's Chamber of Commerce put out a report showing that if they invested more in childcare, they would have $4 billion in returns to their state. And so thinking about how to message this as a return to our whole community and as something that people want and are highly popular, as Jen, I think, will reiterate. So for as much as you can engage in these places, we know that 3 times in a year is a lot to ask of anybody, but there are already, 400 people on this call, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. So anything that you can do to message these, we're here to support you and appreciate your help and are happy to be alongside you through the process. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jen.
All right, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to help folks really think through how to make the case for after school and summer. Jillian just did a fantastic job kind of setting the stage for me and for some of the things that I'm going to cover here today in terms of what kind of research do we have that can help you make the case. So you have a good grounding in like what our challenges might look like and where our opportunities might be. And so we're going to dig into the research that we have that's available to help us take advantage of those opportunities and meet those challenges. On the next slide, I know that many of you here today are very well versed in the value and benefits of after school and summer learning programs. I know our team at the After School Alliance sees it at work every day. We hear from you all, your stories of programs that are introducing young people to new passions, and we hear from young people directly. So just a couple reminders of kind of the reasons why young people value their after school programs here. But on the next slide, you'll see that it's also important to remember the previous attacks on after-school programs and on after-school funding in particular. So this is a sad little trip down memory lane for some of us who have been in the field for a little bit. So on the left, you see a blog post that's referencing a very old study on 21st century community learning centers, as well as a quote from Mick Mulvaney, who was then President Trump's budget director in 2017, talking about 21st century. And on the right is some language from the Trump administration's budget in 2020. Eric referenced what we saw under the previous Trump administration in terms of support or lack of support for after school. We know that to combat these narratives about after school and summer, in addition to just really strong stories from programs and from families and from young people, which we know you all can really help provide, we're also really fortunate to have more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that after school and summer programs are an essential component in the lives of kids and families. So on the next slide, we have an evidence base that really shows quality after school programs not only inspire students to learn, they improve school day attendance, they help our kids learn and grow, and they're also a support for families and communities, a good investment, and they're supported by the public. However, we also know that too many kids want to participate in programs but are unable to. And on the next slide, we can see that from America After 3 p.m., approximately half of all kids not currently in after school, that's roughly 25 million children, would take advantage of after school programs if they were available. And on the next slide, another way to think about that number is that for every child in an after school program, there are 4 more who are missing out on the opportunities that after school programs provide. The next slide shows us that the demand is really clearly there, right? We know the demand is there, but there are barriers that are keeping kids from programs. And we can see from the data that those barriers have really grown over time. Cost, lack of a safe way to get to and from programs, and lack of available programs are really topping the roadblocks to participation. We can also see that the inequities really extend beyond participation in after-school programs. And in fact, lower income youth are less likely to participate in all types of out-of-school time activities. So things like after-school and summer programs, as well as sports, hobby clubs, special lessons, all of that, we see lower levels of participation among our lower income youth. And again, it's because cost is a huge barrier to participation. Families in the highest income bracket are spending 5 times more on out-of-school activities than those in the lowest income bracket. So we're really seeing our low-income youth being priced out of many of these opportunities to learn and grow in the hours outside of school. Okay, so moving along, we know the demand for programs is there, and we know we have the data to demonstrate the barriers and roadblocks to participation. And the research on the outcomes can help us really shed some light on why demand is high and can also help us make the case for greater investment. So moving to those outcomes on the next slide, we can see, first of all, that a number of studies point to after-school programs inspiring learning. On the left here, you see an example of a 21st Century Community Learning Center statewide evaluation that found participants in after-school programs reported they not only liked what they did in their program, but they got to try new things and they were able to engage in activities that made them think critically. On the right, you see a major study that we reference frequently. It's the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, their meta-analysis of 73 studies on after-school programs. And in that, Castle found that students in high-quality after-school programs attend school more often, see improvements in their behavior. Specifically, they're less aggressive. They report higher feelings of self-confidence and self-esteem, and they report more positive feelings and attitudes towards school. And they also see improvements in their school performance, or coursework, as we call it here, both improving their school grades and their achievement test scores. Those ABCs, the attendance, behavior, and coursework, those are really key indicators and early warning signs of dropping out of school. So if we can make a difference in terms of those, we can really help kids do better in school and long-term in life. If we dig a little bit deeper on the next slide into attendance, here you can see some examples of studies that demonstrate after-school programs are helping schools address chronic absenteeism, a huge issue in our country right now and for our young people. We know from the research that after school is helping kids feel more connected to their schools, help them feel more engaged in what they're learning, and helping them have fun, which, you know, we don't talk often enough, right, about young people having fun in and out of school. All of that is helping to get kids to attend school more regularly. On the next slide, we see that participation in after school really also helps close the opportunity gap by giving young people these kinds of opportunities to learn and grow, and ultimately the achievement gap. We have research examining the effect of participation in after-school programs on the left, which found that the more consistent students' participation in after-school is, the greater the gains in math achievement. And this is especially so for low-income students, where we can see the higher levels of participation in after-school lead to smaller math achievement gap between lower income students and their higher income peers. So again, really helping close that achievement gap. And then on the right, we can see a 2020 study that looked at the effects of the combination of early childhood education and after-school activities, and found that both high quality early childcare and after-school programs in elementary school are associated with higher reading comprehension and higher math achievement scores in high school. And these effects are cumulative and they are additive. So, you know, both of them together leads to greater benefits for young people. If we look at the next slide, we can see that there are also a number of ways in which programs are helping our kids develop foundational skills and preparing them for life after high school. So Jillian touched on kind of the importance of this, these sort of lifelong and workforce school skills. This is a sampling of findings from statewide evaluations of 21st Century in particular, where after-school program participants say that their programs are doing everything from helping them work with others and handle problems, skills that we know employers are looking for, and also helping them think about their future, right? So be proactive about what they want to do after high school, including things like college or trade school or work. And then on the next slide, we can see the benefits extend beyond young people to really reaching families and communities. From a survey that we did, we found that more than 8 in 10 parents agree that after-school programs help give working parents peace of mind about their children when they're at work. The same survey also found that parents agreed that after-school programs keep kids safe and helping working parents keep their job. Another study found that parents with high levels of parental after-school stress, so that's that worry in the 3 to 6 p.m. hours, right, about what kids may be doing and the texting and the checking in on them or tracking them, that those parents with those high levels of stress miss 8 unscheduled days of work per year compared to 3 days for those with lower levels. And that parental stress costs businesses up to $300 billion annually. And then lastly, it's also not just about the present day. Research has found long-term benefits for students that participate in programs, and we'll soon have some new research from Deborah Vandell that shows early benefits and lasting effects up through age 26 among the young people who participate in programs. So we'll be sure to share all of that with you soon. All right, I'm going to move into wrapping things up. There are a number of studies on the next slide. Jillian mentioned this already, from states that show that investment in after-school program has positive returns for taxpayers and long-term cost savings. So you can do just a couple examples here, and then the states highlighted in orange are states that have other state-specific studies, and we can share those links with you. And on the next slide, it's no surprise, I think, to any of us that public support is high for after-school programs. Without giving too much away, I can share that a voter poll we conducted in December of 2024 found strong support for after-school and summer programs, and that voters want elected officials to provide more funding for them, even in the climate and context we're in now, where folks are really worried about the economy. We're going to release more details from that poll later this month, so that's something to keep an eye out for and something that hopefully you can put to good use in your communities. All right, ending with some resources on the last couple slides. So here are some links to resources we have that highlight the research, including some state-specific data. I do want to flag that your state after-school networks are always a great source of state-specific information and connections with other after-school programs and resources. Places you can find more on the next slide. Of course, I mentioned America After 3 p.m. already. Our STEM Hub is a great resource with links to specific STEM and after-school resources. Like our quarterly research review that we do and the STEM Ready America compendium. So places where you can really find that connection between after school and STEM skills and interest. And our after school impacts database takes that a step further and expands beyond STEM and really looks at summaries of all kinds of evaluations of after school. Not on the slide, but wanted to mention that the Wallace Foundation also has a tremendous set of resources to help support the field, things around funding, around helping programs collect and use data, and then research on outcomes as well. So that's a great resource for folks to check out. And then my last slide here, there are some of the research-related items to look out for in the coming months. We have some exciting new stuff coming here at the beginning of the year. A brief on the role of after school in reducing chronic absenteeism, new voter polling data, new findings from our ongoing after school provider survey. That's all coming in kind of the first quarter of the year. And then America After 3 p.m. 2025 data in the fall. So we really hope you can put these resources to good use to help grow the support for after school and summer. And I'll be sticking around to help answer any questions in the chat and when we get to the Q&A portion. And I think with that, I can turn it over to Rachel.
Hi, everybody. I am super excited to talk about what we've done here at Shine to kind of advocate for our out-of-school time program in our counties. I want to quickly give you an overview of our 3 counties. So I serve Carbon, Schuylkill, and Carbon and Lehigh County in Pennsylvania. I'm a very rural after school program. We have approximately 16 after school sites. We cover about 750 square miles a night through busing. And we have very little resources for our students. This is our 21st year of after school programming. And I can truly say one of the benefits that we have found is advocating for our after school program and how important it is for our communities and the schools that we serve has been a huge benefit for us. So can I have my first slide, please? So building your relationships with your legislators. Number one, take time to do research on your local legislators. Find out where their interests lie. That is imperative. Find out what is important to them, because we know how out of school time covers so many different facets. So finding that link or that connection when you first make that contact is super helpful in the beginning. Please do not ever be afraid to contact your local legislators. You really are the expert on the programs that you work in. And I know how passionate out of school time providers are. So please let that passion shine through when you're making that first initial contact. Now, if you are having events, what I normally do is at the beginning of every season, I send the majority of events that we are having for that year. And I send it at the beginning to all our local legislators. And I pretty much do not give them an option because I have given them multiple dates over a whole year, making sure that they can most likely find one event to attend. So I don't really take no for an answer, and I am relentless. And I would tell you, I probably could use a different word to describe me at times, but relentless, I think, is the best way to really be when you're really working and trying to build that relationship. I do want to give a short story before I go to the second slide. So probably in a little before 2016, before President Trump's first administration, we had a congressman who was in our area. And probably if you did your research on this specific congressman, you probably would not have thought he would be an advocate for after school. But on a whim, the past director, who was insanely good, decided to invite this congressman. It was Congressman Barletta, to our local elementary school, Panther Valley, which is a very, very impoverished school district, one of the poorest in the state of Pennsylvania. And he came. We had a little center. It was in a kind of a mobile home behind the school. This was before we moved into the school. And he walked in. He had all his people with him. And within 5 minutes of the visit, Congressman Barletta was sitting on the floor with the students, and he stayed for over an hour. And from that moment, he was a huge advocate for after school. So that is why it's so important kind of in that beginning, you start building that relationship, and you never know when that one visit could change realistically the outcomes of just not the programs in your community, but the programs across the United States. So can I have my second slide, please? And then your legislative visit. So on the day of the event, after it's, we've chosen the location, we've picked the time, make sure you communicate with the legislator scheduler, because sometimes things change very rapidly. So always keep communication with that person. I always do a pre-visit with our site, whatever site that is, just to make sure we walk through the day, what time they'll be arriving, making sure that everybody kind of knows their roles. Number three, make sure if the arrival time is around dinner, we serve a hot meal to every one of our students. So sometimes I like to rearrange the schedule to make sure the legislator gets to see the activity part, the STEM part for us. Just making sure we get that legislator involved in whatever activity we're doing. Parents are huge when you have legislative visits, making sure, because that's sometimes difficult for the parents to attend, but making sure you can have somebody there, because they are realistically one of the biggest advocates for out of school time programming. So if a parent can attend, and as well having your students talk is important. Making sure that you have a packet for the legislator for when they leave, so they can reference all the material. Data is really important. I know one of the things I always do is make sure I pull all our up-to-date data here at Shine, and making sure, I talk specifically about how this impacts the communities that they serve, whether that's in workforce, or whatever their interests are, making sure I bring that connection together so they understand why they need to stand up for these programs and why it's important to them. And understand that these are their constituents, the parents, in our out of school time program are really their constituents, and they are voting for them realistically. So just making sure I make that link. And please do not be afraid to express how important these programs are when they're leaving or when they're there. I really try to just let them interact, and I don't really bother them during the visit, but I make sure when they're walking out the door, we're walking through the halls, we're talking about what is after school, what is quality after school program, what does that look like, the number of students we're serving, the impact to the community. We talk about food insecurity. And we talk about how this benefits the districts as well. I always have a superintendent there. I always have, a classroom teacher, so we can all work together to paint the picture of why quality out of school time changes lives. So please, if anybody has any questions, ask me. We've been doing this for a really long time. I can provide, all the information that I have, what a packet looks like, the data that we share. But this is really a key part for not only, the communities that you serve, but what we're about to see. The more people we have advocating and the more legislators that understand the importance is, only going to be beneficial. And I don't know if anybody remembers that slide that Jen showed when Mick Mulvaney said, right when he said that, Peter Alexander, I want to say he was either a NBC or ABC, and he called me actually outside and asked me specifically about Shine after that moment. And that was a game-changing moment when he said that, because we were able to show why out of school time is important. And I don't think any of us would have known how important that was, but that was critical, I think, for, after school being able to show how important we actually are. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and Jen and Jillian, for that great overview and great information, and the impact that the Shine program and Rachel and her team have had, not just on Congressman Barletta, but on so many other members at the state and federal level who have come through and done tours. We're grateful, and it's a great model. And I know many others on the call as well either have or plan to. And we did put we'll follow up in the follow-up email as well, but the link in the chat to the site visit toolkit. So in the time we have left, I know we have a number of questions. Thank you all for your fantastic questions. We will try to get to as many as we can, and then we'll include after in the follow-up email sort of a Q&A answering a number of those as well if we don't get to them all. The first one that I wanted to, well, actually, maybe we'll start with one of the ones near the end there that was in the chat for Rachel, which was, oh, too many screens, was around whether or not you'd be willing to share an example of your packet for legislative site visits and what it looks like with the impact from the data.
So yeah, I can actually share that with the After School Alliance and they can send that out. So we have trend data that we started 15 years ago, and that trend data has really been super important. And I'll be honest with you, my mom started Shine 21 years ago. And to me, after school programming is so personal and so important. And I've seen how it has transformed the communities that I live in. And that trend data that she started so long ago has been realistically so important for us. And it's told our story through data and how cost effective after school programming it is and the impact. So yes, I can share all that and I'll send it to the After School Alliance and they can send that information out and an agenda as well for a visit.
Excellent. Thank you. Gosh, so many don't know where to start. I know there was one, and we'll drop this link in the chat too, around reaching out to members of Congress, how you find your member, whether you can meet with them. You certainly can, either with a member or sometimes staff, but as a constituent, you certainly have a right to meet with your member, either in DC, if you're in Washington, DC at their office, or at their local or if it's senators' offices throughout the state. But the congress.gov site is probably the best place to find your members. You put in your zip code or they may ask you for your address because some congressional districts overlap zip codes, and we'll be able to track it down from there. I'm going to just start from the top of the question. So there was a question about if we have a sense for the new administration and Congress, how the new administration and Congress would feel about extending or expanding the child tax credit. I can start with that, and then Jillian, if you want to jump in as well, or others. But we have seen bipartisan support in Congress for extending the child tax credit, which was part of American Rescue Plan and some of the other pandemic COVID relief, and has been part of bipartisan legislation that got really close to passing, but didn't pass last fall. But has not been lifted up as a priority yet by the incoming administration. But again, folks on Budget Committee in the House and Senate in both parties have talked about the impact that it's had on parents. Jillian, anything you wanted to jump in on there, or we can move on?
Yeah, no, just reinforcing the opportunity to engage in the reconciliation conversations around that, because that is going to be expiring. A number of the benefits that were extended will be expiring with the Tax and Jobs Act in 2025 this year. So want to make sure that we're all doing the advocacy on that, but I haven't heard anything specifically. There are just a number of groups that are motivating around that work.
We had another question on, do you have links to what types of federal funding each state is currently receiving? I recently moved. I'm trying to learn the ins and outs of my new home. So every state receives 21st Century Community Learning Center funding and territories as well. And every state receives funding from the Child Care Development Block Grant that can be used for programming up to ages 12. But I would encourage you to check out, to learn sort of more about the after-school landscape in your state. Sorry, trying to multitask. The link, which I can drop in the chat right now, to the policy state map on the After School Alliance website that will give you more information about what the stats are for your state and what potentially is available there as well. And dropping that in the chat. Oh, thanks, Lucy. There was another question around Republicans supportive or helpful, which I know was discussed in the chat as well, but very much so. So after school and summer are very much bipartisan issues, as was pointed out by the polling data, previous polling data, and the upcoming new polling data, but in Congress as well, with the House and Senate congressional caucuses, both with bipartisan leadership. The slide that sort of went through some of the key champions or key members of the appropriations sort of leadership, as well as the Help Committee leadership. Many of those actually are longtime champions. So Senator Collins, the new incoming chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, was a founding member of the bipartisan Senate After-School Caucus. The chair, Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, chair of the Senate Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, Appropriations Subcommittee, which will be making funding decisions for fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26 for things like education. She was the chair of the House After School Caucus when she was a congresswoman, when she was on the House side before she moved over to the Senate, and remains super supportive and makes it a point to visit after school programs every year, particularly, has ties to 4-H and other programs as well. So those are just a few examples, but there's certainly as a bipartisan issue, and because as Jen sort of outlined in some of the data and research, there's something for everyone, I think, in after school and summer, which is why the issue enjoys and programs enjoy so many key champions from both parties in the House and the Senate. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that one. All right. I'm not going to get to all of these, but what advocacy at the federal level can be done to ensure that 5%, the 5% in the 21st Century Community Learning Center set aside is connected to efforts and resources through statewide after-school networks. This gets a little bit into the weeds, but the 21st Century Community Learning Center program does have a 5% activity set aside that can be used to provide support, evaluation, professional development, a number of other supports to local after-school programs, mainly 21st century grantees in a particular state. Those funds can be shared by the state education agency through a sub-grantee type process or relationship with intermediaries like statewide after-school networks or other after-school intermediaries. Several states, I almost say many states, do that now. Many do not, however. But in terms of changing that policy in any way to add more parameters around it, that would take reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is where 21st Century is. That's not on the radar. As you noticed, we talked about like what's upcoming for this Congress with those sort of three big packages: reconciliation, fiscal year 2025 and fiscal year 2026. You did not see on there Education and Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization. It's not on the radar right now for the House or Senate committees. That doesn't mean that won't change. But the After School Alliance has been convening for over a year now, a work group developing recommendations for enhancing 21st century. And happy to, feel free to connect with us if you're interested in joining that. Always looking for suggestions about what's working, but also what needs to change in 21st century. There was another question about 21st century about another round of funding for this year. That is a state level decision. So every state education agency, 21st Century Office has to determine when and if they're going to do a round of grant making in a particular year. Most states do it every single year, but not all states. Some states may do it every other year. Some states will do it and maybe skip a year or two, depending on the funding available and a number of other factors within the state. But I encourage you to reach out to, I'm not sure which state this participant was from, but I encourage you to reach out to your state education agency, 21st Century Office, or their website, or your statewide after school network to get a better sense of when you might expect another 21st century round in your state. There was a question here as well, I'm cognizant of time, but around potential bans on diversity, equity, inclusion, and or social emotional learning that might affect after school. Does it look like Congress could pass something like this? There is a possibility, and we saw this in the last Trump administration, that there could be some executive orders around limiting the use of federal funds, which potentially could include things like 21st Century Community Learning Center and other funding streams that for certain purposes like diversity, equity, inclusion, or potentially social emotional learning, using those terms. In the past, programs were able to continue to do a lot of their same work by through other funding mechanisms or other avenues. If to the question in particular around legislation, that would need 60 votes in the Senate. And we have pretty slim margins in the House as well to pass anything like that. That would sort of change a policy and parameter around a program. So again, it's one more reason why it's really important that you develop those relationships, as Rachel talked about, with your members of Congress and or their staff, so they understand really firsthand and sort of sit in the tiny desk and eat the snack and understand what the program is all about and what you're doing, so that when they have these decisions to be made or legislation is proposed or discussed with them or their staff, they have firsthand experience of what the programs look like and why they're important to continue on. I see that we're out of time, so I am going to quickly wrap us up here and let you know that thank you to all our speakers and thank you to all of us for joining us today. A quick recap of the issues here are on a slide coming up. Also, the slide you see here, if you want to sign up for updates, please do that if you haven't already. Also, the slides and recording will come to you in a follow-up email. As you know, please feel free to reach out if we can be of additional assistance, or your question didn't get answered. Like I said, we'll follow up with those in the follow-up email for those answers. But I'm happy always to talk through more of this with you all as well. There will be, when you close out of the webinar, the webinar will take you to a page where you can take action and learn more about sort of some of the policy efforts and start that process of reaching out to your member of Congress. And with that, I'm going to wrap up unless anyone from the team has any final words for the group. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today.